Hello, everybody, and welcome to Risk-Based Vulnerability Management Remediation. My name is Sean Coomer. I'm a Senior Security Consultant at Optiv on the Threat, Vulnerability, Management Remediation team. I have over 25 years in cyber and physical security, which specialize mostly in threat and vulnerability management. I am a former police officer and also a former counterintelligence special agent for the U.S. Army. Our agenda today is going to cover the differences between legacy vulnerability management and risk-based vulnerability management. We're going to cover why should you have risk-based vulnerability management, and we're going to look at today's problems with remediation, current remediation techniques, and also finally how to establish a risk-based vulnerability management program. And then we'll have some time in the end for some questions and answers on Discord. What is risk-based vulnerability management? Well, the official definition is the process of prioritizing vulnerabilities for remediation based on asset-assessed intelligence that identifies the level of risk each vulnerability poses on your organization. Risk and vulnerability management is a reality, but however, a lot of organizations believe it can be done without proper asset inventory, vulnerability, and threat context. While threat actors have always targeted the perimeter defenses of an organization, the increase in remote work has brought increased risks as companies struggle to adopt new technologies. This poses a more pronounced risk for organizations that have a large legacy of on-premises infrastructure and have not adopted cloud technologies. Ransomware threat actors can recognize the hallmarks of these legacy environments from the outside, which enable easier lateral movement and deployment of attacks for actors upon entry. This results in a larger disruption to the environment and longer downtime for business operations. Another fact that stands contrary to popular public opinion, the majority of attacks are not overly sophisticated and do not use zero-day vulnerabilities to gain access into an environment. For threat actors targeting your environments, including ransomware groups, it is about finding a single weak link, one small oversight or gap in security that can yield a great return. The good news for organizations is that you don't have to have a massive security budget to secure your environments or your network. The challenge then becomes on how to sift through and understand the large number of existing vulnerabilities. This is where risk-based vulnerability management comes into. Mitigating vulnerabilities can seem like a daunting task, especially for organizations that do not have proper staffing to tackle the endless number of vulnerabilities emerging every day. Whereas vulnerability management focuses mainly on identifying vulnerabilities and classifying them based on the severity of the vulnerability itself. Risk-based vulnerability management adds contextual information related to the risk and impact to your environment, not just a general risk rating of the vulnerability itself. So now we're going to talk about the differences between legacy vulnerability management and risk-based vulnerability management. The old way of looking at vulnerability management is basic scanning, throwing in an IP range and just let the scanner scan the entire environment without actually focusing on specific zones or specific networks. Also, the old way of vulnerability management is looking at the CVSS severity ratings and just going by those. That is a very, very basic way of looking and classifying vulnerabilities. It doesn't look at where the asset's located, what's the criticality, and how bad the vulnerability is. Another way, the old style of vulnerability management is just reporting all the vulnerabilities and throwing them out to your infrastructure and your remediation teams. They get confused. They look at this very, very long list of vulnerabilities and they just start shotgunning on trying to get all these vulnerabilities remediated without actually having any context towards it. And finally, the legacy vulnerability management just checks the box. That way, organization can actually say, yes, we do have a vulnerability management program. So now we look at risk-based vulnerability management. First, we prioritize remediation. We actually look at the vulnerabilities and see how it impacts our environment. Is there a proof of concept exploit? Is there an automated exploit? Is there anything in the wild? What is the threat feed saying? We look at the asset criticality. Where does it sit in the environment? Is it in the DMZ? Is it an edge server? Maybe does it have PCI or PHI on it? We look at real world threat modeling. We're going to actually look at the asset, the location of the asset, the vulnerabilities. Is it being exploited? Is it a POC? Is it in the wild? What is the actual model of that vulnerability? And then last is the organization's attack service. When you identify where the attackers can try to enter, what's the cause that would affect our organization if breached, or if data was extracted on a particular system or environment. So why do we want to do risk-based vulnerability management? There's more and more 0 days being released every single day, and the time between remediation and the time to exploit is definitely decreasing. There are too many severe and critical vulnerabilities queued for remediation. There's no prioritization of the assets. So as we said before, the remediation teams and the infrastructure teams have no idea what to address first, what to remediate first. How important is it? There are many, many top priority vulnerabilities ending up being irrelevant. Basically, we have a lot of older vulnerabilities that could be up to 10 years old, for instance, like TLS 1.0. Yes, the CVSS score ends up being high for some of the exploits. However, if it sits way inside your environment, it may not be as important as something on an edge server or in the DMZ. So remediation teams end up wasting their time. And of course, as we said before, the wave of work from home trend is definitely increasing. Being with the pandemic, with everybody working from home these days, the importance of normal applications are being accessed by employees is extremely important. For instance, our third-party browsers. A lot of employees are allowed to download certain extensions, and currently there is approximately up to 3 million endpoints that may have malware that ends up being started as an extension from your third-party browsers. So let's say you have a list of 25 vulnerabilities rated critical. A simple vulnerability management approach would suggest that all of them need to be patched ASAP. Well, a risk-based vulnerability approach allows you to prioritize based on the true risk they pose to your organization. For example, if you identify a vulnerability on an endpoint device or an edge server, that number one, if exploited, could provide an attacker access into your internal environment. Number two, is actively being exploited in the wild. And then number three, would affect your entire environment. And that deserves your highest attention. Compare this to another critical vulnerability of an internal system that, if exploited, could lead to an unauthorized access to a limited amount of non-confidential information. While it is still important to address, the internal vulnerability would require a threat actor to already have access to your internal environment. So it should not have the same level of urgency as a vulnerability in the DMZ that could provide access. That additional context is very important in prioritizing your response. So how is your CMDB? I know it's kind of a funny subject, and most organizations I've worked for, they say our CMDB is broken. So we're going to take a look of today's outlook and problems with remediation. We have a rapid expanse of IT assets and infrastructure. Our infrastructure teams are spitting out servers and endpoints very quickly. However, they're not properly updating or putting the data into the CMDB. So therefore, we're having hard issues with discovering and having asset inventory. The asset lifespan can last from minutes to years. They may have a system that just gets spun up, and now you have data on your vulnerability management platform very, very old, and we don't know if it's being scanned or not anymore. And that data might be old, and then your assets, your infrastructure teams, your remediation teams cannot remediate that because the asset no longer exists. Traditional IT enterprise tools cannot keep up with the changing environment. There's a lot of tools out there and a lot of platforms that claim that they can map their network and do great asset discovery. While that is true, it's not a foolproof way of looking at asset inventory. And of course, CMDBs are not up to date or they're incomplete. It's mostly a snapshot of the environment. Like I said, as the old saying is, junk in, junk out. So we're also going to look at today's current problems. So now we have more assets, that equals more vulnerabilities. The length from vulnerability discovered to exploitation is decreasing rapidly. You'll see a theme throughout this session. Traditional vulnerability scanning does not represent an accurate risk assessment. Without having assessed the vulnerability and taken into account where the asset is located and then the criticality, we need to make sure we put all those three together and have a good assessment. There are many tools out there now, vulnerability management platforms, that claim that they can do this type of risk-based vulnerability management. However, there's still a lot of manual process. You still need to analyze your environment. You have to analyze the assets, and then of course the criticality of the vulnerability, and then see if there's an exploit. And you have to take into account a lot of threat feeds and information coming in from third parties. Of course, and then last, the CVSS shows technical severity and not the current risk of the organization. It doesn't take into account if there actually is a vulnerability is currently being exploited. It doesn't take in effect where that asset is located. And once again, it doesn't know your attack surface of your organization. So current remediation techniques. Right now, we have a lot of times organizations are remediate patching during pre-planned maintenance windows. Well, that maintenance window could be 30 minutes. So they can only maybe do 200 or 300 different systems, and then it gets carried over to the next maintenance window. And that's the kind of shotgun approach where we're giving the remediation teams an all vulnerability report, and they don't know what to remediate first. Remediate the vulnerabilities as a whole. Okay, it's the same as that first point there. They don't know which assets to prioritize and which vulnerabilities to remediate first. And once again, time to remediate is sometimes greater than time to exploit. The bad actors work very, very hard to weaponize these vulnerabilities and exploits. So a lot of times, the exploit comes out even before the vulnerability is remediated. And then, of course, compensating controls are not always available and they're not always effective. Yes, IDR and MDR systems and tools work very, very well. However, the bad actors work very, very hard to work around those. And then, of course, you have instances where user interaction takes place for phishing, stuff like that, where the actual user has a big impact to the vulnerability. So critical vulnerabilities, and I like to show this because just a lot of times this is what a CISO does when major vulnerabilities hit the media. They panic. So we'll look at a couple critical vulnerabilities in the recent time. One that we're all very familiar with is Log4j that affected the Apache's Log4j library. It's an open source logging framework. It's extremely easy to exploit, but it's hard to remediate. The reason why it was hard to remediate because a lot of tools and a lot of middleware and applications use Log4j. However, we didn't know what that list was. We didn't know what products was using it. And once again, it was actively being exploited. WannaCry, once again, another Friday afternoon exploit. The patch came out in March 2017, and it became exploitable in May 2017. That was part of the NSA's their hacking program. A lot of CISOs were panicking, wanting to know, hey, what systems do we still have that needs to be remediated? Their SLAs just wasn't as good as they should be. And then we also have Heartbleed and Apache Struts too. Very, very serious vulnerabilities. And these are things that sometimes keep CISOs open or up at night. So how to establish a risk-based vulnerability management program? So first, we're going to look at proper visibility. Now, everything starts with knowing or identifying what your assets are. This includes your managed systems, servers, workstations, network devices for both internal and external facing devices. Additionally, knowing what third-party applications are critical and their usage. Additionally, knowing what third-party applications are critical and their usage. This can range from software and services you're hosting on the perimeter to business applications used for day-to-day operations. An example, your PDF readers, your Adobe's, your Word document programs, etc. Second is scan and monitor your assets for known vulnerabilities. Continuous vulnerability monitoring is a concept that is starting to gain traction, so you achieve near real-time visibility on vulnerabilities for your organization. That can be actual physical scans, it could be agents. There's a lot of different ways that you can actually track the vulnerabilities and do your real-time scanning. This ties very well into patch management program that helps remediate vulnerabilities. For companies that are unable to achieve continuous monitoring, start with weekly vulnerability scans and possibly an annual penetration test. Now, this will help fill the gaps between the scans and monitoring the patch releases for your core systems and applications, and then categorize the risk on the information provided in the release from vendors. Obviously, if you could do daily, that'd be the best. But we want to make sure that you have a good scanning and vulnerability management program so that you can get as close to real-time monitoring as you can. The end goal is to patch critical and easier targeted systems as quickly as possible. That's the main thing. You want to make sure that you look at your vulnerabilities, the critical assets, do a good threat modeling, and then prioritize what needs to be done first. For instance, like the log4j, you want to make sure that, if you would know what assets sit on the edge or what is in the DMZ, what might be used in log4j, you can go ahead and remediate those first, and then get those done within the first 24, 72 hours, whatever the quickest you can. And then you can maybe relax a little bit, for instance, your internal systems that might be behind 3 or 4, next generation firewalls, so that it's a little bit safer that the bad actors can actually scan and look for. Next is prioritize remediation based on the threat context. Context is everything. You need to know the type of vulnerability you're dealing with, the level of impact it could have on your environment if it was exploited. If it was exploited, that's the driving force behind how you prioritize your activities, especially if you have a small team. The IT and security team should guide the business on understanding the risk and take initiative to patch systems and applications when a critical patch is released. This is very important to monitor all your threat feeds. Check your vendor releases, look at your third-party information coming in, and obviously look at your scans. If you have a high risk rating, take a look at that. See where it's listed at. Go into your vulnerability management platforms. Start tagging things. Makes things a lot easier. You're tagging on your DMZ, you're tagging on your edge servers. Look at your critical assets. Tag those also. And then obviously you want to keep on the CMDB teams to make sure it's updated. Make sure your infrastructure teams, when they are creating these new assets, are fully completing the CMDB and all the data fields. It's very, very important when it comes to the remediation, especially in these emergency situations, when something comes down the line as a heartbleed or WannaCry, that way, it's much faster. You can have everything done and sit back and relax a little bit instead of spending, your entire weekend or the entire week spending hours upon hours trying to remediate these issues, attending endless meetings, and then of course, having, the leadership teams constant contact and where are we at, and the last thing they want to hear is, I don't know. So last is remediate and verify. Once you remediate, test it. Okay. I often see reports from IT teams or IT service providers that something has been patched, or when we run our vulnerability scan again, we notice that it wasn't applied properly or not to all the critical assessed assets. When dealing with critical vulnerabilities that could significantly impact your organization, a double check is worth the small time investment to reduce the likelihood that something was overlooked. You need to make sure that, check your false positives. Okay, a lot of times your infrastructure teams will come back to that's a false positive, or that was superseded by another patch. We need to remediate. we need to verify it. And we definitely need to test it. We want to make sure that, is it actually a false positive? Was it actually, is there a superseded patch out there? The IT infrastructure teams, they may actually be right about this, but, you don't want to, just go by somebody's word and say, yeah, we patched it, and you move on and the last thing you want to know is, or there's a breach. Obviously when the breach happens, you can't say, oh, I forgot, or, oh, we didn't test it. Very, very important to make sure we get that, this last step done. So I hope we have some questions and answers, and we will be going this on Discord on the Optiv Source Zircon Discord, and I will be there answering questions live. So thank you very much for attending my session on risk-based vulnerability management, and I look forward to your questions.